On the 4th of June 1944, a man stood alone in a stone-walled room in southern England. Outside, the wind howled, rain lashed the windows. The English Channel, that narrow strip of water separating free men from occupied Europe, was a churning grey fury. His name was Dwight David Eisenhower, and in his hand he held a piece of paper. On that paper, he had written something that only a handful of people in history have ever had to write. He had written his own defeat. A letter accepting full and total responsibility should the greatest military operation ever attempted end in catastrophe. Thousands of young men, crammed into ships and aircraft, were waiting for his order, waiting to cross that channel, waiting to storm the beaches of Normandy, waiting to begin the liberation of an entire continent. He could send them, or he could wait. If he sent them and the weather was wrong, if the seas swamped the landing craft, if the fog blinded the paratroopers, if the timing collapsed, they would die. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, and the war in Europe might be lost. If he waited, another week, another month, the window of tides and moonlight would close, the secret would leak, the Germans would reposition, and the war in Europe might also be lost. This is the story of the man who made that decision. Not just on that rain-soaked June night, but across 5 years of the most devastating conflict in human history. This is the story of Dwight Eisenhower, the soldier, the commander, the strategist, and the extraordinary burden he chose to carry. To understand Eisenhower, you must first understand where he came from, because nothing about his origin suggested greatness. Nothing pointed towards supreme commander. Nothing whispered of D-Day or of liberation. He was born on the 14th of October, 1890, in Denison, Texas, the third of 7 boys, to a family of modest means and deep faith. When he was still an infant, his parents moved to Abilene, Kansas, a flat, wind-scraped town on the edge of the American plains. There, his father worked in a creamery, his mother tended the home, raised the boys, and read aloud from the Bible. It was not a life of privilege. The Eisenhower boys wore hand-me-down clothes, they grew their own vegetables. They learned early and clearly that nothing in this world was given freely, that you worked for what you had, and you were grateful for what you earned. But there was something in that home poverty could not diminish. Eisenhower's mother, Ida, was a woman of enormous inner strength. When young Dwight, furious at being left behind while his brothers went trick-or-treating, beat his fists bloody against an apple tree, it was Ida who sat with him, who held his hands, who told him firmly, "The only person you can truly hurt with uncontrolled anger is yourself." He never forgot that lesson. In the years to come, when the pressures of command would have broken lesser men, Eisenhower's famous composure, his steady, unshakable calm, would trace its roots back to that woman and that apple tree in Abilene, Kansas. He was not a brilliant student, but he was competitive and possessed of a mind that could absorb complex information and distill it clearly. When a friend told him about West Point, where a poor boy could get a world-class education for free, Eisenhower applied, not out of military ambition, mostly because it was a door he did not have to pay to walk through. He entered West Point in 1911 and graduated in 1915 in a class later called the class the stars fell on. Of its 164 graduates, 59 would eventually reach the rank of general. Among them, Omar Bradley and Dwight Eisenhower. History is rarely kind to those who are patient. And for the first 2 decades of his military career, Eisenhower was extraordinarily patient because he had to be. He missed the First World War entirely. Not for lack of trying, he requested deployment to France multiple times. Each time, his superiors refused. They needed him at home. He trained men, built camps, mastered logistics, and watched others ship off to glory while he stayed behind, burning with frustration. The years that followed were years of stagnation. Congress slashed budgets. Officers who had commanded brigades led companies. Promotions that should have taken 3 years took 10. Eisenhower spent 16 years at the rank of major. But he did not waste those years. He studied. He read voraciously. History, strategy, biography. He wrote papers on the future of tank warfare that were so forward-thinking, so radical in their embrace of armored mobility, that he was nearly brought before a disciplinary board for contradicting official doctrine. He served under General Fox Connor in Panama, a brilliant officer who told him plainly, "We will fight another world war, and it will be a war of alliances. You need to understand how alliances break, and how to keep them from breaking." He served as an aide to General John Pershing. He served under General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines, a difficult, complicated relationship with one of the most egotistical commanders in American history. When Eisenhower eventually asked to leave MacArthur's service, MacArthur reportedly told him he was throwing away his career. Eisenhower left anyway. What those long years built was a mind uniquely prepared for the war that was coming. One that understood logistics as deeply as tactics, politics as clearly as strategy, and knew how to manage difficult personalities because he had spent years managing the most difficult personality in the American army. By the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, Eisenhower was 51 years old. He was a brigadier general, largely unknown outside military circles. He had never commanded troops in combat. And yet within days of the attack, Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall summoned him to Washington. Marshall looked at him across a desk and posed a blunt question. What should we do in the Pacific? Eisenhower asked for a few hours. He went to a desk, thought hard, and wrote a clear, concise memorandum laying out America's strategic priorities. It was decisive, it was logical, it cut through emotion and politics to the core of what needed to be done. Marshall read it. And Marshall, who had a gift for recognizing exceptional ability, made a decision. He was going to give this man the weight of the world. In the summer of 1942, Eisenhower arrived in London as Commanding General, European Theatre of Operations. He had never led a division in combat, never overseen an amphibious landing, never managed the nightmare of keeping allied nations, each with their own politics, pride, and traditions, moving in the same direction. None of that mattered to Marshall. Because Marshall had seen something rarer than tactical brilliance, the ability to make difficult, proud, brilliant people work together. In this war, that ability was perhaps the most critical weapon of all. The alliance that would ultimately destroy Nazi Germany was at its core a fragile and combustible thing. The British and the Americans had fundamentally different ideas about how to fight the war. Winston Churchill, shaped by the catastrophic losses of the First World War, was deeply cautious about a direct cross-channel invasion. He favored striking at the periphery, North Africa, Italy, the soft underbelly of Europe, wearing the Germans down before attempting a frontal assault. The Americans, impatient and direct, wanted to strike at the heart of Germany as quickly as possible. They thought the British were being timid. The British thought the Americans were being reckless. And then there were the personalities. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, brilliant, meticulous, and so sublimely arrogant that he seemed almost to regard human interaction as beneath him, did not take orders gracefully. He questioned, he delayed, he second-guessed, all with the calm certainty of a man who believed he was simply the finest military mind alive. Eisenhower tolerated him, choled him, worked around him, and when necessary, threatened him, quietly, but with steel beneath the patience. Then there was General George Patton, brilliant, reckless, spectacular, a cavalry officer reborn as a tank commander who believed that speed and violence of action could solve almost any tactical problem. Patton drove his men harder than almost anyone in the American army. He inspired fanatical loyalty. He also slapped a hospitalized soldier across the face during the Sicily campaign, accusing him of cowardice, nearly destroying his career and causing an international incident. It fell to Eisenhower to save him, not because Patton deserved saving, but because Patton's gifts, his ability to move fast, to terrify, to never let the enemy rest, would be needed ahead. He reprimanded Patton severely, in private, and saved one of the war's most effective weapons for the battles that were coming. This was Eisenhower's gift, not the dramatic gesture, not the cavalry charge, the endless, exhausting, invisible labor of keeping the machine running, absorbing pressure from above and below, making difficult men feel valued enough to keep fighting, even when they despised each other. He understood something profound. The supreme commander is not the man who wins the battle. He is the man who makes it possible for other men to win, the architect, the conductor. And in November of 1942, the orchestra played its first movement. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, was Eisenhower's first major test as a commander, and for a time, it appeared he might fail it. The landings in Morocco and Algeria went relatively smoothly, but what followed was a brutal education. American troops, untested and unprepared, encountered the Afrika Korps, Rommel's hardened veterans, and were handed a series of humiliating defeats. At the Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, the Germans tore through American lines with stunning ease, killing nearly 10,000 men. The criticism was fierce. American generals were called incompetent. Eisenhower's leadership was questioned. There were whispers that Marshall had made a mistake, that this untested staff officer was not the man for the job. Eisenhower did not flinch. He made changes. Hard, necessary, ruthless changes. He relieved commanders who were not performing. He demanded better intelligence, better logistics, better coordination. He pressed his corps commanders for more aggressive action, and then, slowly, battle by battle, week by week, the tide began to turn. By May of 1943, 300,000 Axis troops had surrendered in Tunisia. The last German and Italian forces in North Africa were defeated. The Mediterranean was open, and Eisenhower had learnt something that no staff college could ever have taught him. He had learnt what defeat felt like, and he had learnt how to recover from it without losing himself. Sicily followed in July of 1943, a complex operation that drove the Axis from the island in 38 days. Then came the long, grinding agony of Italy, a slog up a peninsula of mountains and rivers that the Germans defended with genius and ferocity. It was Eisenhower's war to manage, to keep the alliance together, to prevent the British and American commands from fracturing. He managed it. Barely, sometimes, but he managed it. And all the while, back in London, the planning for something far larger, far more dangerous, far more decisive, was quietly, secretly, relentlessly proceeding. Operation Overlord. The name itself was deliberate, chosen to convey supreme power, supreme authority. The plan was simple in concept and almost incomprehensibly complex in execution. Allied forces would cross the English Channel, land on the beaches of Normandy in northern France, establish a beachhead, break out, and drive east, ultimately to the Rhine, and then into the heart of Germany itself. In reality, it was the most audacious amphibious assault in history. 5 beaches across a 50-mile front, 5 divisions at dawn, paratroopers in darkness, naval bombardment, air support, and behind all of it, the largest deception operation in military history, designed to convince the Germans the real invasion was coming somewhere else. Eisenhower took command of Overlord in December of 1943. He immediately pushed to widen the assault from 3 divisions to 5, adding Utah Beach on the western flank and creating space to drive toward Cherbourg. The next months were a relentless grind of planning, logistics, argument, and preparation. Every detail mattered. The tides had to be right. The moon had to be right. The weather, always the weather, had to cooperate, at least enough to allow the ships to cross and the aircraft to fly. Eisenhower met daily with his meteorological team. He consulted with his corps commanders. He inspected troops, hundreds of thousands of them, looking men in the eye, shaking hands, trying to project the calm confidence that he often did not feel, because privately, the doubts were enormous. The German defenses in Normandy were formidable. Rommel had spent months strengthening the beaches, steel obstacles, mines, bunkers, artillery emplacements. He believed the invasion would be decided in the first 24 hours. He had worked accordingly. And the Germans had approximately 58 divisions in France. The Allies would initially be landing with a fraction of that strength. If the Germans could react quickly, if they could rush armored reserves to Normandy before the beachhead was secure, they could drive the invasion back into the sea. Eisenhower knew this. He knew it every day, every hour. It lived with him in his quarters, sat across from him at dinner, stared at him from the ceiling at 3 in the morning. By late May, nearly 3 million men were staged in southern England. 7,000 ships packed the harbors. The secret held, the greatest military secret in history, held by millions of people. The original date was the 5th of June. Then the weather intervened. On the 3rd of June 1944, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, delivered news that was close to catastrophic. A deep depression was moving in from the Atlantic. Winds, cloud cover, high seas, conditions that would make the crossing dangerous, the bombardment inaccurate, the paratroop drops potentially deadly. Eisenhower postponed. The ships that had already put to sea were recalled. 3 million men sat and waited. The most tightly wound spring in military history held its tension for one more day. On the evening of the 4th of June, Stagg returned. He had found something, a narrow, fragile window in the weather. 36 hours, perhaps 48, of acceptable conditions beginning on the night of the 5th into the 6th. Winds would be high, seas would be rough, conditions would not be ideal, but they would be workable. Eisenhower looked around the room at his commanders. He asked each of them in turn. Montgomery said go. Tedder was cautious. Lee Mallory worried about the air. Ramsey said his naval forces could manage. Then Eisenhower was silent for what felt like a very long time. Okay, he said quietly, we'll go. That night, as darkness fell over England, he drove out to the airfields where the American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were preparing to board their aircraft. He moved among them, talking, joking, asking where they were from. One soldier asked Eisenhower to sign his jacket. He did. Then he signed another and another. The paratroopers boarded their aircraft. The engines started. One by one, the planes taxied and lifted into the darkening sky, heading south, toward France, toward the unknown, toward the most consequential night in the history of the Western world. Eisenhower stood on the tarmac and watched until the last one disappeared. His naval aide, Commander Harry Butcher, later wrote that when he turned to look at Eisenhower in that moment, he saw tears in the man's eyes. Those young men were going to do the most dangerous thing he had ever ordered anyone to do, and he had sent them. He went back to his quarters, and he sat down, and he took out a piece of paper and wrote the message that history almost never saw, the message accepting full personal responsibility for the failure of the operation. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops, it began. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. He folded the paper, put it in his pocket, and then he waited for dawn. Shortly after midnight on the 6th of June 1944, the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions began dropping into Normandy. The drops were scattered. Anti-aircraft fire was fierce. Many men landed miles from their objectives, in fields, in trees, in flooded marshes. Some drowned before they ever fired a shot, but they fought. In small groups, in darkness, with no clear picture of what was happening around them, they fought. They blew bridges, they seized road junctions. They tied down German reserves at the critical moment when every hour counted. At 6:30 in the morning, the landing craft hit the beaches. At Utah Beach, on the western flank, the Americans landed in the wrong place, 4,000 yards south of their intended objective. It turned out to be a better beach. Resistance was relatively light, casualties were manageable, Utah would succeed. At Omaha Beach, the story was different. Omaha was a natural fortress, high bluffs commanded the beach. The naval bombardment had missed most of the German bunkers. The tanks meant to support the infantry sank in the rough water, and the German division defending Omaha was one of their best. Veterans, dug in, experienced. The men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions came off their landing craft into a maelstrom. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, a wall of fire that met them the moment the ramps dropped. Men died before they touched the sand. They died in the water. They died at the wire. By mid-morning, the situation at Omaha was so desperate that at one point, Bradley considered abandoning the beach entirely and redirecting resources. But the men on that beach did not stop. Small groups of soldiers, leaderless, under fire, with no clear plan, found ways up the bluffs. One at a time, in ones and twos and small desperate clusters, they climbed. They flanked the German positions. They killed the men in the bunkers. They did it because there was nothing else to do, because behind them was the sea, and in front of them was the rest of their lives. By nightfall on the 6th of June, all 5 beaches were in Allied hands. 156,000 men had crossed the channel and come ashore. The beachhead was thin, shallow and vulnerable in places, but it existed. The wall had been cracked. For the first time in the war, Allied forces stood on French soil and could not be dislodged. Eisenhower did not celebrate. The losses, roughly 10,000 Allied casualties on D-Day, with nearly 2,500 killed, weighed on him with a heaviness that would never entirely lift. Every name represented a decision he had made. Every death was, in some way, his responsibility. He carried that weight. He had chosen to. The weeks that followed D-Day were among the most frustrating of the entire campaign. The beachhead expanded, but slowly, slower than the planners had hoped. The Normandy bocage, a maze of ancient earthen hedgerows, some of them 12 feet high and 6 feet thick, turned every field into a fortress. German defenders used the terrain with devastating skill. Tank after tank was destroyed, trying to push through gaps in the hedgerows. Montgomery's British and Canadian forces ground away at Caen, a city that was supposed to fall on D-Day itself, for weeks. It did not fall, it burned. And the argument between Eisenhower and Montgomery over strategy, over pace, over whose fault it was that the campaign was moving slowly, became one of the defining tensions of the war's final year. But something was building. On the 25th of July, 1944, American forces launched Operation Cobra, a massive carpet bombing attack, followed by a ground assault that finally broke through the German lines south of St. Lo. And then Patton, finally unleashed, commanding the newly activated Third Army, began to move. What followed was extraordinary. Patton's columns swept south and then east, moving so fast that German headquarters often did not know where he was. The Third Army swung around the western flank and encircled the German force in Normandy. At the Falaise pocket, 50,000 soldiers were trapped. The German army in France effectively ceased to exist. Paris was liberated on the 25th of August. The city erupted in joy that had been imprisoned for 4 years. Eisenhower entered the city the following day, received with an outpouring of emotion that he found almost overwhelming. He had spent years working toward this moment, and now that it was here, it felt less like triumph than like relief. There was still so much to do. The race across France astonished even the most optimistic planners. By early September, Allied forces had crossed the Seine, liberated Belgium, and were approaching the German border, covering in weeks what some had predicted would take a year. But supply lines, stretched to breaking point, began to strangle the advance. Eisenhower faced a critical decision: how to allocate the insufficient fuel and supplies his armies had left. Montgomery wanted everything. He proposed a narrow, concentrated thrust, his famous single-thrust strategy, to punch through Germany's defenses in the north and end the war before Christmas. Patton, in the south, wanted everything too, and said with characteristic bluntness that given adequate fuel he could be in Berlin in 2 weeks. Eisenhower chose a broad front, advancing along multiple axes simultaneously, preventing the enemy from concentrating their reserves. It was less dramatic than either alternative. It was also more sound. Montgomery never forgave him. History has largely vindicated Eisenhower's caution. By December of 1944, the Allied armies were exhausted and dangerously thin. Winter had set in. The optimism of summer had curdled into the grinding weariness of a war that refused to end. In Washington, in London, in the press, voices were beginning to ask, why is it taking so long? And then, on the 16th of December, the German army answered the question for them. Hitler had assembled the last great reserve of the Third Reich, nearly 250,000 men, 600 tanks, and sent them through the Ardennes forest, a section of the American line that Allied intelligence had considered too rough for a major offensive. They were wrong. The attack crashed through American positions with terrifying force. Units were overrun and destroyed. In fog and snow, with Allied air power grounded, the German panzers drove deep into Belgium, creating the bulge that gave the battle its name. For the first time since the summer, genuine panic rippled through Allied headquarters. At Eisenhower's headquarters in Versailles, the initial reports were confused and alarming. Some of his staff were frightened, some were uncertain. Eisenhower was neither. At a crisis conference on the 19th of December, Eisenhower looked at the map and said, "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table." He saw what the German offensive had actually created, not a breakthrough, but a trap. By committing their last reserves, the Germans had exposed themselves. Hold the shoulders, cut the spearheads off from supply, and the last strategic reserve of the Wehrmacht could be destroyed. He called Patton, and what Patton accomplished in the next 72 hours stands as one of the most remarkable feats in the history of the American army. Patton had already anticipated the order. He had already begun turning his Third Army 90 degrees north, a maneuver most experts said was impossible in winter conditions, under fire. When Eisenhower told him the attack needed to begin within 48 hours, Patton said he could begin in 24. He was ready in 48. On the 26th of December, the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne, where the surrounded 101st Airborne had held out, famously refusing to surrender. The German offensive had been blunted. The crisis had passed. Eisenhower had looked at catastrophe, and he had seen opportunity. That, perhaps more than any other single moment of the war, defined what made him extraordinary. By early 1945, the German army was broken in the west. The bulge had consumed its last reserves. The Rhine, the great natural barrier of Germany, the river that Hitler had declared would never be crossed by an enemy force, lay ahead. On the 7th of March 1945, troops of the 9th Armored Division arrived at the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, a bridge the Germans had failed to destroy. They crossed it. Under fire, American soldiers poured across the Rhine and established the first Allied bridgehead on German soil. When Eisenhower received the news, it is said that for the first time in months, he laughed. The end came fast. Within weeks, Allied forces were deep inside Germany. On the 30th of April, Hitler took his own life in a bunker beneath a burning Berlin. On the 7th of May, 1945, at 2:41 in the morning, in a schoolhouse in Rinz, Germany, signed the unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. Eisenhower, who had been awake for most of the preceding days, received the German delegation in a room he deliberately left bare of ceremony. He did not want comfort for the men who were surrendering the forces that had caused so much death. After the signing, he sent a message to the combined chiefs of staff. After years of complex strategic communications, he sent 3 sentences. The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241, local time May 7, 1945. Dwight Eisenhower returned to the United States a hero. Ticker tape parades, crowds unlike anything the country had seen. He went home to Abilene, Kansas, to the town that had made him, and stood before the people who had known him before the world knew his name. He was, in his own quiet way, unchanged. What he demonstrated across 5 years of war was not the heroism of novels, not the cavalry charge, not the lone stand on the hill. It was something harder and rarer. Sustained, disciplined leadership under conditions that would have broken most human beings. He had managed an alliance that had every reason to fracture. He had made decisions that sent hundreds of thousands of men into situations where many of them would die, knowing full well what that meant. He absorbed the blame when things went wrong, redirected the credit when things went right, and kept moving. There is a photograph taken of Eisenhower on the evening of the 5th of June 1944. He stands among the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, young men with faces darkened with camouflage, expressions caught between fear and determination. Eisenhower is smiling. Nothing in the photograph tells you he has just written a letter accepting responsibility for their potential deaths. Nothing reveals the weight he is carrying. That was his gift, and his burden, but it is the soldier we remember most. The man in the stone-walled room in England. The man on the tarmac watching the planes disappear into the dark. The man who wrote the letter that hoped to never be sent. In the years after the war, Eisenhower was once asked what D-Day had cost him personally. He thought for a moment, and then he answered simply, "I have no way of measuring the distress of mind I had. How do you measure the anguish of the parents, the wives, the children of the men who did not come back?" That was Dwight Eisenhower. Not a man who was unafraid. Not a man who did not feel the weight of what he ordered, but a man who felt every ounce of it, and who decided, again and again and again, that the weight was his to carry. So the next time someone asks you what leadership looks like, tell them it looks like a man standing on a tarmac in the dark, watching young men fly toward the most dangerous night in history, with tears in his eyes, a letter of failure in his pocket, and the quiet, unshakable certainty that it was the right thing to do. That was Eisenhower. That was the man who carried the world.